we started this economics webinar, MA Economics webinar series last week. So the idea is to reach out to students and hopefully encourage them to apply for our postgraduate and undergraduate economics programs. So a quick word about Ahmedabad University for those of you who are joining us for the first time. So Ahmedabad University is obviously based in Ahmedabad, a university which believes in interdisciplinarity. We are a very young university, and we are, taking this interdisciplinarity very seriously, much before the new education policy has started speaking about it. So, it's a very interesting and a very exciting time for Indian education, and Ahmedabad University is very proud to be a part of this new changes in the Indian education system. And just like the interdisciplinarity in the university, our undergraduate and postgraduate economics programs are basically follow the interdisciplinary nature, and we are going fairly aggressively on the interdisciplinarity front. And since I am the chair of the MA Economics program, I would like to just say a few words about the program. That this is quite a interesting new kind of a program where we are laying economics foundations and also giving the students the tools, the four pillars of data analytics, technology, uh, finance, and industry. So the idea is that the students should be able to apply their skills in these industries using these tools, because in today's world, uh, a combination of data analytics and technology, machine learning, artificial intelligence are becoming key skills. Amazon is one of the biggest recruiters for economics, and they really value uh, high-end data analytics and technology skills. So our MA program is offering two specializations. One is a general economics specialization, and another is in finance. And the program enables you to work in different domains of government policy, central banks, international organizations, private sector, fintechs, academic institutions, and so on and so forth. And a unique bit about our program is that we are housed in the business school, Amrit Modi School of Management. So as a result, students can take uh, some of these finance and management oriented courses and equip themselves for working in the new age industry. Okay, so in case you are interested in the program, do feel free to reach out to us, or in case any of your family or friends are interested and looking for a new kind of an MA program, do reach out to us. You can visit us on the website, and we'll just share a link on the chat box. So be separately emailing you uh, after this webinar. So coming to today's webinar, we have a very interesting. Last week we spoke about the ongoing banking crisis, and today we speak about today Professor Puneet Arora is going to speak about applying experimental economics in the field of education. Quick profile of Professor Puneet. He's an assistant professor at Ahmedabad University with research interests in the area of development, public, and experimental economics. He has conducted several field experiments with the Indian education system to study the causal impact of different behavioral nudges on student learning. His current research studies the dynamics of gender discrimination in academia. Puneet holds a PhD degree in economics from Georgia State University, an MA in economics from Delhi School of Economics, and a BA from University of Delhi. Puneet, over to you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Amol. And thank you, everyone, for coming and attending this presentation. If you are sure, I'm assuming either you are interested in learning more about the master's program at Ahmedabad University, which Amol has already talked about, or you are interested in knowing about the method of experiments, its application in the field of education, or you may be interested in both. So, I mean, those of you who've studied economics at any level would have heard about this term experimental economics, and might be interested in knowing more about it. So today's today's talk, I'm going to focus the first half of it on talking about what is research in the field of economics, and then where does experimental economics fall within that. So I'll talk about experimental economics in brief, but most of the first half is going to be a motivation directed towards that. And the second half of that, or maybe the last 1/3 of that, will be talking about the research that has been done, experimental research that has been done in the area of education in India and other developing countries, and the lessons that we can take from that. So diving into it, so here's the agenda. So first question is, why should we study education? Then I'll talk about what is research, the theory and the empirics behind the idea of research. And then what are the typical problems that as an empirical economist we face and we try to solve. Then the solutions to those problems come in the methods that that are causal research methods. So I'll briefly sort of name them. And then lastly, I'll talk about the experimental studies that have been conducted in the field of education. So here are some statistics. In 2018-19, India spent 3% of its GDP on education, which if you compare with the sort of other clubs of countries, I mean, in comparison to high income countries, that's relatively low, because they spend about 5% of the GDP and we are spending about 3% of ours. So ours probably falls somewhere around the low income countries. So low income countries on average spend 3.2% of their GDP on education, and we are spending about 3% of our GDP. So it's a low share of GDP in comparison to some middle and high income countries. And therefore, it becomes very important for us to know whether we are spending it right or not. Are there more efficient, more effective ways of spending this limited budget that we have for education? So when we study education, what are the major problems that we observe in that? So the first one is, we observe that enrollment in school does not guarantee human capital. There's evidence which shows learning gap. I'll talk about some numbers in the next slide. There is evidence that there's high dropout. Students enroll and then, I mean, halfway through the program, they drop out. Then there's also evidence that students enroll, but they don't turn up for classes. So there's high attendance. High absenteeism or low attendance in schools. So these are three major problems that an education economist tries to solve. So just to throw some numbers here. These numbers come from ASER report, which is an organization doing surveys as part of Pratham. So Pratham is the sort of parent entity for that. So they find that more than 95% of 6 to 14-year-old students enrolled in schools. So that's the enrollment rate, very high. About 30% of them study in private schools. 44% 4-year-olds and 26% 5-year-olds are enrolled in Anganwadis, but their cognitive skills are far lower than their counterpart in private LKG, UKG. So that's the first outcome that you guys should keep in mind, that private sort of schools, the LKG, UKG offering preschools, they're doing better than the government-run Anganwadis in terms of the cognitive skills of these students. Then the next important statistic that we should keep in mind is only 16% grade 1 kids and 50% of the grade 3 kids have the expected reading skills of a grade 1 level student. So this is the major learning gap that we have. Students are getting promoted to next grade levels, but they can't read even at the grade level of a grade 1 kid. So this is very concerning. 27% of grade 8 kids could not read a grade 2 level text. Average student attendance across primary and upper primary schools is 72%. So these are all statistics that bring to us that there's a problem. There's a problem of learning gap. There's a problem of low attendance, even though we managed to increase the enrollment in schools, right? And these statistics are from rural India. So ASER survey is done in the rural India, not in the urban part of India. So as researchers, what do we do? What do we want to do? So what education policies increase student enrollment, attendance, and completed years of schooling? That's the first agenda that we take forward. And next is what education policies increase student learning. So in the early days, the focus, in those 1990s, the focus used to be on increasing the enrollment. That's something that was achieved in early 2000s. But after that, the focus started to take a shift towards student learning, and that started to happen after ASER came into picture in 2005, and they kept on doing their surveys showing that people are not learning at their grade level. So student learning took the sort of came to the forefront, and that's where most of the research today is focused. So we in today's lecture are going to focus on the demand side policies, which are aimed at increasing the demand of education from its customers. And when we say customers, we talk about students, parents, who are the consumers of education. So here's a book that those of you who haven't heard about, or those of you who haven't read, I'll recommend you guys to read it. So More Than Good Intention. So the basic idea behind this book is that instead of finding policies that work, we should find the policies which are most effective in their work, in their effectiveness. Because as an economist, you know that there's limited budget and there are several alternatives. So the objective is to find the alternative that achieves the objective in the most cost-effective manner. And that's what this book talks about, and gives you several examples from the research world, from the real world, wherein there are different policies that were implemented and which were thought of to be having a lot of impact, but then they were not, because they were not evaluated. And on the other hand, there were others which were having an effect, but you could have used that same budget in some other policy and got a bigger effect of that. Right. So that kind of idea is what is there in this book, and I'll recommend you people to go ahead and read that book. So now I'm going to talk about what is research. What is it that I do? What is it that we as a researcher bunch in the world around you are doing, are trying to do? So research, as I see it, can be broken down into two parts. Some people might be doing the first one, some people might be doing the second one, some people might be doing the two together. So the first part is theory. So when we say theory, in simple words, it's a story. It's a cause and effect story which knits together the dependent variable and the independent variable to explain the mechanism of how X affects Y. So if X is the independent variable, you want to know how X affects Y. So you think about a story. You could write that story descriptively, you could write that story mathematically, you could write that story in an econometric equation. Whichever way you think about it, that's a theoretical construct that you're thinking about. Researchers, typically researchers take that as the first step, and from there they derive their hypothesis, right? Some people stop there. Some people say that this is the theory of a particular context in mind, and they stop there. So that's also research. Some people go a step further and test that theory through empirics. Those empirics, by empirics, they do quantitative or qualitative studies to test the hypotheses that have come from the theory. I'll give examples of both of these, but and as I said, some people do just the theory, some people do just the empirics, some people combine the two. And when you combine the two, typically the optimal advisory is to go for theory first, think of a theoretical construct in your mind, and then come to the empirics to test that. On the other hand, there are several settings wherein the vice versa is more suited, wherein you have some data, you test some hypothesis through that data, and you get certain results, and from those results you think of a theory, you think of a story that could explain those results. So you go to the theory next. So whichever way you do it, it's still part of research. So now I'm giving you an example of a theory, a simple education theory. So in that education theory, I need to think of two things. What is the dependent variable, the outcome variable, which we'll call Y, and what are the independent variables, the explanatory variables, which we'll call X. So the dependent variables, depending on what question, what theory you are constructing, what idea you have in mind, could be child learning, could be child's attendance, could be child's enrollment, could be a child's completed years of schooling. So those are the dependent variable, which depend on a lot of factors, on a lot of independent variables, right? So here I'm giving you an example wherein I'm taking child learning as the dependent variable. So it's influenced by several independent variables, X's, So let's take a few examples of those X's. So the first such X could be parents' own endowments. That endowment could be their money, could be their education. So based on, so I mean, you would have seen around you that people who are rich, their kids go on to study more. Their kids probably turn out to be maybe more intelligent. Is there a causal relation between the two? We'll talk about that, but this is a correlational statement that I'm making, that more wealthy parents, more educated parents tend to have more educated kids as well. Parent provided education input, that could be the second sort of parent related factor, wherein the more time parents spend on their kids education, that is also likely to lead to better learning of the child, right? So parental input in terms of the time and effort spent with the kid is going to lead to an output which is higher learning for the child. So that's one independent variable. Another, let's say, child related independent variable, or the student related independent variable, it could be a child's own endowment. A child could be born with certain cognitive and non-cognitive abilities. They can also be developed, but they're born with certain things. The nutrition and health aspects that they're given at the early years, at the tender years, they become their endowment in the later life, and they also determine their learning. Kids who are more healthy, they tend to learn more, they tend to study more. And input, so child input, which comes in the form of time and effort spent at studies, that also determines the child learning level, right? So these are independent variables. Lastly, school inputs could be the infrastructure. So the better the school infrastructure, the better learning you can expect from a kid. The better the quality of teachers that the school has hired, the better learning you can expect from a kid. And teacher inputs could be the effort that the teacher spends. So there's a lot of research around which shows that teachers don't even come to classes, especially when it comes to government schools. There's high absenteeism in teachers. So there's low effort at the end of teacher. So if teacher effort could increase, that's going to lead to better learning for the students as well. So these factors could be the independent variables that may explain to you the learning level of a child. The lower parental endowment, the lower effort by parents, the lower effort by child, lower or bad quality school infrastructure, all of these factors are going to result in lower learning level of a child. And I'm making these statements in a very correlational sense. I'm not saying that they X causes Y. That is what I'm going to come to later. But right now I'm saying that you tend to see the two together correlationally. So that was an example of theory. Then we talk about empirics. So when I talk about empirical analysis, what is it that I'm looking at? So the question that I'm asking in an empirical analysis is, does X have an effect on Y? Now I'm asking that question. Does parental education have an effect on students' learning level? So it's a causal claim that I'm testing. If my parents are more educated, will that lead to more education for me as well? Will that increase my learning level? So that's a causal statement. Cause, I mean, parental education is the cause and my learning level is the effect of that. So does X have an effect on Y? If yes, how much does X affect Y? I mean, if my parents get one more year of education, how much extra education can I expect to get basis that, right? Is that a significant evidence? I mean, is that significant enough for me to say that yes, parents do affect child's learning level, or is that a minimal effect which we shouldn't care about, and therefore parents' education does not have an effect on us, right? So is that significant or not? That's another important question that we ask in empirical analysis. So to answer all these questions, what we need is data. Without data, you can't do empirics. So we need data on the dependent variables that you have in mind. So the dependent variable on the previous slide that I had was child learning, right? So learning typically can be proxied by their academic performance on exams, right? So the academic performance could be used as a proxy for student learning. If you're testing their attendance, if your parents are more educated, will that lead to you attending more classes? If you want to test that kind of a relationship, then you need data on attendance, because you're testing the outcome, the dependent variable, which is attendance. If you want to see whether more parental education leads to more completed years of my schooling, again, you need data on the number of school years that I've completed, right, at the end of my education. So these are the data you need on dependent variables. And then independent variables are, as we already discussed, you need data on parental income, parental education, parental involvement, neighborhood attributes. Each of these factors may have an effect on students' learning, students' attendance, students' completed year of education. So you need data on these variables, as many of these variables as you can, to figure out whether a particular factor affects the dependent variable that you have in mind. Okay, so with this theory, the previous theory that we with this previous theory in mind, as I said, you need to think of a story. So this is the story that you thought, and this in education or in economics of education, we call it the education production function. So the output being child learning, and then rest of them being the independent variables. So this is the kind of data that you need to test that theory empirically, right? So the two combined together make for the ideal kind of research. And then if you do find that parental education have an effect on child's learning level, then you can go to a policy maker and you can tell that we should increase the level of education as much as possible, because people who are studying today, tomorrow they'll become parents, then that will have a positive effect on their kids. So there's intergenerational effect of that, right? Similarly, if from this study you find that there's a positive effect of students' effort on education, on their learning, then you'll go to the policy maker and pitch to them that let's come up with policies which could increase students' effort, because more effort leads to more learning, right? So all these things you can do. You can go to a policy maker and advise them if you have some empirical evidence on that. You can't concoct things. I mean, theoretically, you can't just think about them and then go to a policy maker and tell them to do it, because they'll want you to come with data. So empirics in that sense becomes very, very important. Now, if you look at this picture, then in this picture, you see one vehicle which is moving. I mean, this is a static picture, so I can't show you the vehicle is moving. And there's a person pushing that vehicle. And if you'll show this kind of a picture to somebody or to a common man, the common man might tell you that it's this person who's pushing the vehicle and the vehicle is moving, right? So, and the way they'll make this statement is that it's the push of this person that makes this vehicle moving. So if I have to break this statement down into a dependent and an independent variable, then the vehicle moving is the independent variable, and the force or the push by the person behind in the pink t-shirt is the independent variable. The push by this person is making the vehicle moving. So a layman would say, yes, that's happening. But if you go behind this, behind the scenes, and see the reality, there are two people who are down on the floor. They are the ones who are moving it. They are the ones who are pushing the vehicle and moving it, right? So in reality, this is where major problem with empirics come. People typically look at these two, the vehicle and this person, and they make a statement that it's this person who is making the vehicle moving, right? But in reality, there may be a third factor. There may be other people. This is something we call omitted variable. You may have missed out on these people if you didn't look that far behind. And you may end up making a claim that it's this person in orange t-shirt who's making this vehicle move, but that's wrong. It's people on the ground who are making it move. So this is called the omitted variable bias. So as a researcher who's keen on studying the cause and effect relationship, you must always try to go behind the scenes, figure out if there are any variables that I'm omitting that may be contributing to the change that you're observing in the society. Change here being the vehicle moving, right? So this is first reason due to which the typical data, just to give you another interesting example. So during summers, we observe that the sales of ice cream increases, and also we observe that cases of kids drowning in the swimming pool also increase. So this will make somebody or a common man make a claim that we should not make our kids eat ice cream, because with increased demand for ice cream, there's increased drowning that's happening in the swimming pools, right? But what are we missing here? Anybody could figure out what are we missing here? Is it the increased swimming, increased ice cream that's causing the drowning, or could there be some third factor that we may be missing? People have commented in the chat box. That's correct. So So people standing behind the vehicle, the parallel to that in the other example is the weather. It's the summer season. During summers, you observe more people wishing to eat ice cream. And it's during summers, you observe more people joining the swimming lessons, doing more swimming. And when you have more swimming happening, then the chances, or in absolute number, the number of people you'll come across drowning will also increase. So it's the summer which is the missing variable. So if you miss out on that, you might come up with an incorrect causal claim. You might say that it's the ice cream causing the drowning of people, but that's not the case. So that's why as a researcher, you have to be very, very cautious. And that's why when you think theoretically, so the idea behind a story, a theory, is to think of the mechanism that may be causing Y. All the channels coming through X that may be causing Y. So that's the idea behind having a theory in your research study. Let's go to another similar example. So let's read it from the left. So someday I want to get married because studies show that married people are happier. So here the independent and dependent variables are, so the dependent variable is happiness and the independent variable is marriage. So if you get into marriage, you'll be happy. That's what this first box claims. But in the second box, we get to hear a different story. A smarter interpretation is that no one wants to marry an unhappy person. So this is called reverse causality, wherein what they're trying to say is it may not necessarily be the case that marriage causes happiness. It could be vice versa, wherein it's the happier people who can manage to get married, who can manage to find a counter person who's willing to get married to them, right? Unhappy people fail to find a person willing to get married to them. So it's therefore only the happy people are getting married. So what you thought is as an effect of marriage, the happiness as an effect of marriage is actually the reverse effect, wherein it's the happy people getting married, right? So therefore, again, as a researcher, you might make a claim that marriage makes you happy because whosoever I see around who is married, I find them happy. That may be an incorrect claim because you might be missing out on the reverse causality, the opposite direction effect of that. Right. So as a researcher, it's important you have to find out which direction the effect is flowing or how much of the effect is flowing in the direction that you are targeting. So now from those examples, from those motivation, we come to some questions in education. So so the first one, which would have come to the mind of several of you as students and came to sort of our thought as well as instructors, which is, are Zoom classes or online classes more effective than physical classes in improving student learning? And suppose I give you data. Let's say I tell you that students who studied during the Zoom class with me this year performed much better than the students who studied with me in the last year. Okay. And last year I was teaching, let's say, on-campus classes, using on-campus classes. So from this, you might say that Zoom classes are so much better. They improve student learning. Therefore, we should shift to Zoom classes. What do you think is the fault with that kind of a statement? What are we missing? Anybody?
Sir, the reason can be that the students are getting away with cheating easily on Zoom classes. That is why they're scoring well.
Yeah. So that could be one reason. On Zoom classes, I mean, as students who've experienced it also, you know much more than I do. So in Zoom classes, there could be cheating going on. And in on-campus classes, there may be lesser cheating, right? So as a result, the effect that you're observing may be not attributed to the mode of classes, but to other factors, which are missing, which you are omitting from your story, right? So in your story, if you bring in, if you know that it could be cheating causing this difference, then you should get some data on cheating, add that to the context, and then you've taken care of that. But in addition to that, there could be other factors. Anybody else? I mean, what else could we be missing in this story? Yes. So somebody, so Sharvari in the chat box has mentioned that there could be different cohorts, and that's a very important point. And that's why typically you'll observe researchers, I mean, not comparing this cohort with last cohort. They do with certain other contexts. I mean, there needs to be more sophistication to the method. But in a simple setting, which many of you might be thinking that It's easy. I mean, I compare students who studied a microeconomics class this year with students who studied a microeconomics class last year. And if students performed better this year, then Zoom is working, right? It's simple. It's not that simple, because students who are studying microeconomics this year are different from students who studied microeconomics last year. That's one reason. Similarly, university may have come up with different rules. The course structure might have changed. There could be several factors which make your life difficult when you compare this year's student with last year's student, right? So that is why this kind of comparison may not be good. Similarly, there are studies which find that college educated people earn more on average than people who studied only until the high school. In this context, basically they're making a claim that if you go to college, you make more money than if you study only until the high school. This is a correlational claim. If you want to make this claim causal, right? So just to tell you, I mean, a counterfactual or a different story of this, suppose you want to prove that this is true, then what you need is same person. I mean, you need, let's say, twins. You need two people who are clones of each other. One person should go on and study until college. Another person should stop at high school education. Compare the two. If there's a difference in their average salary, then you can say that yes, this is due to education. But what you're doing right now is you're studying people who went on to do college education versus students who stopped at high school. The two lots are very different. The two lots are different in their motivation. Students who stopped at high school, they were not motivated enough to go and study further. Students who went on to do college education, they were much more motivated. So from there, I can tell you that those students who went on to college, even if they did not go to college, they'll still be making more money, because it's the motivation that may matter. They are highly motivated. So if you are highly motivated, maybe education is not leading to higher salaries. Without, I mean, you know of several entrepreneurs who didn't go to colleges, who stopped their education at school level, and still they're making big money, right? So the founder of Oyo Rooms is one such example. So it's the motivation that may matter. And this statement that I'm making here, which is that college educated people make more money than high school educated people, that is just correlational. I see these things together, but is it education causing more a salary? That I'm not too sure, right? Because the two set of people may be different. If I want to find out whether education causes more salaries, then I need to have two lots of people who are same, who are identical, and then one lot goes ahead to get more education, another lot stops right there, and then I see later on, is that leading to any difference in their wages? So that would be an ideal way to do it. So those are more in the experimental methods. I'll come to that. Let me talk about the last statement here. Studies find that private schools show better academic performance on average than government schools. And this is a statement that probably 99% of you sitting here, or a majority proportion sitting here, would agree to, that just private schools perform better than government schools in terms of the student learning and lots of other education related factors. But if you again look at the kind of students who go to private schools versus the kind of students who go to government schools, students going to private schools, majority of them would come from wealthy families, educated parents, highly educated, highly motivated kids. All those factors make them different from the kids going to government schools. So kids going to government schools, majority will not have parents who are well educated, majority will not come from wealthy backgrounds, majority will not be highly motivated. I mean, you need to push them to even go to school, right? So if you are making a comparison of the academic performance of students studying at private schools versus government schools, you are misleading people, because the two groups are not comparable. If you want to compare them, then you should take a lot of students, randomly assign them, half of them to private schools, half of them to government schools, and then see whether there's a difference later on in their life, right? That's again experiments. So but right now, the way we are making the statement that studying at private school will improve your academic performance in comparison to if you're studying at government school, that may be a misleading statement. That's just correlational evidence. That's not causal. From that, we come to this major statement that I'm making here, which is correlational. Correlation does not imply causality. And that's the bread and butter for majority of the social scientists. That's what we are after. That's what we want to prove. We want to prove causality. We want to prove that X causes Y and not X is correlated with Y. X correlated with Y may not be of too much implications, policy implications, but X causes Y will be very useful in terms of policy implications. So just because students studied through Zoom classes versus on-campus classes and they scored more on average does not necessarily mean that it is online classes that cause higher learning outcome. Similarly, if you are college educated, then that does not mean that it's the college education that causes higher income. Similarly, if you went to private school, that doesn't mean that it's the private school that made you a better student or improved your academic performance, right? So it's not the causal relation that we are talking about when we make those statements. It is simple correlation. But that's the job of a researcher, that you have to figure out how much of that correlation is the causal effect, is the cause and effect relation. All of that can be summarized into this couple of words, which is selection problem. And what do I mean by that? So there's a problem of missing counterfactual, which we've discussed in those examples, that if you're talking about students studying using Zoom classes this year, and you're comparing them with students with studying through on-campus classes last year, then they are not comparable. You want to compare students this year with, studying through Zoom with students this year studying through physical classes, and those two lots should look similar. And just to give you a very, very sort of simple example, so if I create a clone of myself, by a clone, I mean that individual also does exactly the same thing that I do, is also equally motivated, is has the same parents, all the things are absolutely identical. And then I go ahead and I do PhD, and my clone stops at masters. And then maybe 6 years, 7 years down the line, when I finish my PhD and my clone just did masters and is on the job market working, 6 years, 7 years down the line, I compare the wages. And when I do that, then you can say that it's the PhD degree that may be leading to more wages for this person, because the two of us were absolutely identical. The only difference was the education, right? But the clone, which we also call the counterfactual, is missing. That's not realistic, right? So this is called the problem of missing counterfactual. To answer research questions, you want counterfactuals, you want clones, wherein one kind of people go ahead and get the intervention what you want to study, other kind of people don't, right? But that's the problem that we face, the problem of missing counterfactual. We never observe the counterfactual, which is, you can also call it the path not taken. If I go ahead and do PhD, I can't stop at masters. If I stop at masters, I can't go ahead and do PhD. So you can find me only in one state of the world. You can't find me in both states of the world. And therefore you can't compare me with PhD and without PhD, right? And if you make my comparison with somebody else who finished masters and stopped, then you're making a wrong comparison, because that person may not be like me. The person may not be as motivated as me. The person may not have as much parental education as me. The person may not have as much wealth as me. So the person may be very different from me. As a result, it's difficult for you to compare the two kind of people, right? So the counterfactuals are missing. And that's where all of us researchers put our brains to and create counterfactuals. They are missing, but we use statistics, we use econometrics to somehow create counterfactuals of the data that we have, or we create data, right? So if we don't do it, then we are comparing apples with oranges. We are comparing private school kids with government school kids. One are apple, one are orange. You can't make the comparison and say that private schools improve education. That's a wrong statement. That's a wrong claim. So it's called a selection bias. It's called the problem of selection bias. So when can we have the cause and effect? Whenever I can say that it's the online classes that cause better academic performance, whenever I can say that private education causes better academic performance and college education causes higher earning, whenever I can make this statement, then I deserve the right to go to a policymaker and tell them do this, because I have evidence for that, right? So that's a cause and effect statement, and that's probably what we are after. So within the field of economics, if some of you do go ahead and do masters, then you'll come across all these methods, and these methods are used to create the counterfactual as best as we can. So it starts from experimental method. The RCT is one kind of experimental method. which, I mean, most of you would be aware of. The Nobel Prize in 2019 went to people who do RCTs or went for RCTs. And then there are other quasi-experimental methods. Quasi-experimental methods are the methods that you use when you have secondary data. Experimental methods, you create your own data, primary data. In quasi-experimental, you have existing data. With that data, you look at it and you say, how can I create a counterfactual with this data? So these methods help you figure out which, I mean, how can you sort of slice that data into the treatment group and the control group, which is the counterfactual. Okay, and which method you use is determined by the kind of data that you have. So the availability of data will determine that. So I'm not going to go into these methods because that's an entire course or maybe more than one course at the university. But yeah, so there are methods that can help you create that counterfactual. The major problem of missing counterfactual, these methods can help you figure that out. So this is the slide on experiments. So what do we do when we do experiments or when we do RCTs? We create those clones that I talked about. How do we do that? We do random assignment of people to control and treatment groups. This is exactly what you find in clinical trials. I mean, the vaccine trials that are happening, they have an intervention group which is getting the real vaccine, and there's a placebo group which is gets sort of a placebo vaccine, right? So, and those people are divided into groups randomly. So that's the very simple way of explaining what is an experiment. You randomly assign half the set of people to control group who do not receive the intervention and another half to treatment group who receive the intervention. That intervention could be more education, that intervention could be parental more education, right? That intervention could be more wealth. So anything that you would like, that becomes your treatment group if you want to study the effect of that. The control group should not have it, but these two groups should be created randomly. That's the idea behind it. If randomization is done properly, then characteristics will be the same on average in both treatment and control group. When I make this statement, I'm saying that on average, you'll have both the groups clones of each other. If you have large set of people in both the groups and the groups have been created randomly, then you've managed to create the clones of each other. And that is the ultimate goal that we had of causal research. And then in the end, we can simply compare the two groups and observe the differences between their outcomes and make a cause and effect relationship. And that's what we researchers do. And this is just one of the methods. As I said, there are other methods that you can study. Now, moving on, I'll give you some examples of the experimental research that is being done in education, the broader categories of it. And that's in no way encompassing all the research in education, just giving you some examples of it. So here are some examples from the early childhood interventions that have been done. So so in this experiment, they did simple activities like playing, reading, and singing with children, and they wanted to study whether such kind of activities affect their cognitive development. So how did they do this intervention? Home visits to help caregivers enhance the quality of home simulation environment for 0 to 3-year-old kids in Cuttack, Odisha. So people went, gave this kind of training to the mothers or the caregivers. A training in the playing, reading, and singing kind of things to be done with the kids of 0 to 3-year age group. And they found that there's a positive effect of that on the cognitive development of kids. They found bigger effect on boys. Similar studies have been done in Jamaica and other countries. A very famous program came from Perry Preschool in US, wherein again teachers simply visited the houses of little kids just to do a status check, maybe for 5-10 minutes. And they found that later on, 10-20 years down the line, those kids were doing much better than the kids whose houses were not paid visit to by these people, these experts, right? So this is one such example wherein an experiment helps you figure out that how such simple basic interventions can improve the cognitive skills of the child, and which can have impact much at a sort of in the longer run, right? So then we talk about health intervention. So there's this very important study from Kenya on school-based mass deworming, wherein, I mean, kids were given these deworming vaccines in an experimental setting. They created control and treatment groups. And what they observed is that students who received this deworming medicine, they started attending classes much more. So the treatment group was attending much more number of classes, much more percentage of classes than the control group. So simple health-based intervention had an unintended consequence on the education. So it definitely improved their health, but it also improved their attendance. And then later on, it also improved their sort of later longer run outcomes. So there was another study done 10 years later on those kids, and they found that those kids were they attended more school. So the school number of completed school years was higher for those kind of kids. They were working at a higher paying job. The gender pay gap was lower for these kind of treated kids who received this deworming medicine. A higher percent of them were working in manufacturing sector than agricultural jobs. There were informational interventions that were done, wherein, so this is a sort of a recent study done in Pakistan, wherein school report card, I mean, the overall school's report card, how the school is doing, the pass percentage of the kids in that school, the overall learning outcomes. So all those kind of things were written for every school, and those school report cards were shared with the parents in the neighborhood. And what they observed is that it improved school performance in the subsequent years by 42%. So this is basically an example of schools being made to be accountable. Now their performance is being sort of brought in front of parents, and parents will start to withdraw their kids from those schools if those schools are not doing well. And as a result, the year this was shared, in the subsequent years, the school performance improved by a lot. This is a very simple information intervention. All of this data is administrative data. You can use that, share that with people, and improve schools performance. An easy intervention that was done in Pakistan. Similarly, other such interventions, behavioral interventions in the field of education, came from, these were the early interventions, early behavioral interventions in education, which were done in Brazil and US, wherein they sent real-time text messages and alerts about student attendance and performance to parents. So there's an assumption that parents know everything about kids, but when they sent these text messages, they realized that student performance increased a lot. Parental participation in schools increased a lot. What does it mean? It means that there is attention deficit in parents. Parents are not keeping full attention on the kids. They don't know about everything about their kid. And these simple text messages made them more aware, made them more accountable. And as a result, the student performance increased by a lot. What is the issue? So in India, such kind of a study is missing. And the problem is that, I mean, if you were to send these text messages to parents, most of those parents can't read these text messages. I mean, the phone technology that they may have, they may not be using it for the text messaging services. So the lower income setting that we have, so we can do something similar, maybe think of a broader India setting and see what can we do here. And in fact, in the current scenario, when the use of phone has increased drastically, and the internet in the phones, especially during the COVID times, I think this kind of a study becomes very much valid for an Indian setting as well. So we may see something like this in the future. Other such studies, so over 40% of grade 8 boys in the Dominican Republic did not expect their future earnings to be higher if they completed secondary school compared to only completing primary school. So this is simple information gap. Students, 40% of grade 8 students didn't know that if they completed secondary school, their future earnings will be higher. So in this study, they simply gave that information to kids in grade 8. And what they observed, that it increased students' graduation. So students who used to drop out earlier, they went on, they studied more, they completed more years of schooling by just knowing this simple fact that if I study more, I'll be able to make more money. Right. So this is an information intervention, a very, very simple information intervention that can bring drastic changes. Another one, changing perception of possible career opportunities for educated women led parents and students to invest more in their education in India. So this is a study from India wherein I mean, perceptions about career opportunities were changed. I mean, people don't know much about that. So once you give that kind of information, you can observe the effect of that. So this is what was showed in India. And the third bullet point here is very interesting, where parents and children do not underestimate the benefits of education, or the benefits are already salient. Providing information is unlikely to increase student attendance. I mean, when parents already are aware about their kids, everything about their kid, then if you give them that information through text messages or through emailers, it's not likely to change their attendance. But on the other side, in such cases, providing information could even reduce attendance if parents and students had overestimated the benefits of education. So you send such emails, such text messages telling them the benefits of education. And it may actually reduce student attendance and student participation in school setting, because student and parents might have thought that the benefit of education are much higher, but you corrected those beliefs. And as a result, in China, what they observed is that students started attending lesser number of classes, the attendance reduced. So there could be, I mean, it's a two-way street. You can find results either way, depending on what is the current belief system and how you're changing it. So this is a study from India. So ASAR, I mean, I described about it earlier. So ASAR has been doing yearly surveys with kids in rural India, trying to find out their learning level, the foundational skills that they have. And they've been finding that there's huge learning gap. And as a result, an intervention was done, which is called the teaching at the right level. So you know that a grade 8 student can't even read a grade 2 level textbook. If you give a grade 8 level textbook to that student to read, the student is going to fail, right? So you should firstly raise the level of that student from grade 2 to 3, 3 to 4, so on and so forth. So you should teach any student at the right level, which means at their own grade level, rather than, I mean, bringing everybody to the same level and teaching them at the same level. You should differentiate basis on that difference. So this program is called Teaching at the Right Level. According to this program, students are grouped based on their learning and not on their age and grade. And when they did that, so several states in India have been doing this kind of an intervention. And what they found is that there's an improvement in the fundamental reading and math skills of these students. So Pratham and JPL are implementing this kind of a program in several states of India, and it's working well. Then other kind of interventions that have been tested are financial and in-kind incentives. So as economists, we believe that people are driven by incentives. Those incentives are there even for a student. Why is a student not coming to class? Because the student is not incentivized. That incentive may be sort of intrinsic incentive or extrinsic. So studies have tried to give them sort of extrinsic, tangible, maybe financial or in-kind incentive, and tried to see whether that can help bringing these kids to classes, whether that can help increasing their learning. So there have been those in-kind and financial, in-kind and monetary incentives that have been given to schools. So conditional cash transfer is a very, very famous program that has been tried in several developing countries, and it seems to work pretty well. In India, that has been tried as well. Free cycles to girls in Bihar is a program that was done, and it worked well. Similarly, free school uniforms or school meals in Kenya, Jamaica, and other countries is being run with the same objective, that maybe giving them food will incentivize them to come to school and attend school so that they can get food. Giving them uniform may incentivize them to come dressed well to school and attend those classes. So those kind of incentives may incentivize a kid to come to school, which without such incentives may be missing, and therefore we may not be able to sort of maximize the outcomes of education. So yeah, so that is maybe a helicopter tour of education in brief. And that's, as I said, that's not all. Education research is expanding by leaps and bounds. So yeah, that's where I will stop and conclude here. So research has shown several low-cost policies to be more effective than high-cost policies. And it's always ideal to consider marginal benefit and marginal cost of several interventions to rank them, rather than saying that, okay, uniforms work. I mean, let's give uniforms to students and they improve student performance, so uniforms work. You have limited budget, so you should actually try to compare benefits of uniform, benefits of school meal, benefits of something else which could be tried in the same budget, and whichever gives the maximum benefit, you should go for that. So marginal benefit, marginal costs, I mean, you should compare and rank the interventions. Such a ranking helps policymakers prioritize on where to allocate funds. It's not that uniforms are not important or school meals are not important, but if you have limited funds, you want to prioritize which of these is going to help the most in the first place, and then go on to the next set of interventions. There are several concerns with experimental interventions. They may not be clean causal estimation. I mean, you created a control and treatment group, but you might find some spillovers, you might find some attritions. All those factors may lead to some biased estimation. So those factors need to be kept into consideration. What you might be studying may be a short run effect. I mean, an incentive of the in-kind nature or a monetary nature may work for a year, but maybe 3 years down the line, it may stop working. But according to your policy, you might say that kick it in, I mean, bring it on. But so therefore you should, I mean, as a researcher, you should study the effect of a policy in short run and long run, but there are several constraints on you as a researcher that you fail to do it, right? So those are part of concerns. External validity, you may have done an intervention with a particular kind of group. Cycles given to girl children in Bihar worked well, but will it work well in Haryana? Will it work well in Gujarat? You don't know. So the external validity of an intervention in a particular geographic context, I mean, it's questionable. So those are the questions that are typically raised. Even the similar interventions have very different design details, making them incomparable. And the partial versus general equilibrium effect. So let me not talk about them, and probably in the interest of time, stop here. So yeah, if you have any questions, you can ask me now.
Thanks, Puneet. That was indeed wonderful. It was almost like some sort of a primer on.
Hello, Amol, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
This is, I mean, a general discussion question, so maybe Puneet can throw some light on it. I missed certain parts of the presentation, but the general question is, how do you distinguish between students who are intrinsically motivated and not? Like, the measures can work differently on certain types of students who are intrinsically motivated versus others who are not.
Mm-hmm.
And the two questions are, how do you capture intrinsic motivation, and what is your answer to this question?
So, I mean, that's a good question, and that's a difficult question. It's very difficult to capture intrinsic motivation, and that's why it's intrinsic. So, I mean, that's why in experimental world, when we do it, we divide students randomly. Mm-hmm. And as a result, let's say there are 50% of the students who are intrinsically motivated. So you'll find 25% of them on the left-hand side group and 25% of them on the right-hand side group. So on average, that will balance it out. But then what you're asking me is maybe a heterogeneity kind of analysis, wherein can I pick up students who are intrinsically motivated and see whether it has an effect. I mean, what kind of effect does the policy have on differential effect on them? So, I mean, there's no objective measure of maybe intrinsic motivation. People might use different kinds of proxies for that. I mean, in US context, maybe you can say that, I mean, you conduct a standardized test which does not have any, which does not have any sort of implications for you per se as a student. Students who are doing better, I mean, you can say that those students might be more intrinsically motivated than students who are not, because there's research which shows that when you give them incentive, you can improve the performance of students just by giving them money on those exams. Right? So writing an exam in itself may be a boring thing, and students may not want to indulge in that. But the moment you offer them money to write that exam, they'll put their full sort of attention to that, and I mean, they'll score better on those exams. So intrinsic motivation in that sense depends on the context that you're studying, and depending on the variables that you have, you can try to proxy it. But I don't see any objective measure of an intrinsic motivation that you can study. And that's why RCTs, what they try to do is they give you an average effect of that. And then you can break it down by the variables that you have. You can break it down by the parental education. You can break it down by other factors.
Like
unless and until you've sort of randomized on those factors, you can't make causal claims. So those are all going to be correlational claims when you slice your data.
Some kind of socio-economic factors, like if they're coming from a certain background, or if they have certain level of education of their parents, it's more likely they would be intrinsically motivated. But that's the best that we can do.
Exactly.
General kind of a, like a question, maybe if some students also think in those like directions, or, like Ahmedabad University has the 80% attendance, requirement. I mean, does it work better on students who are actually good, or it makes the students who are not good to care more? I mean, quote unquote, care more, but not really pay attention in class because they don't want to be there in the first place. Right. So we don't know. So,
I mean, exactly. There's research which shows that, I mean, in this carrot and stick kind of policy, if you are, I mean, using the stick and you are bringing students to classroom by this kind of a policy, they may still come to, I mean, they may come to classroom because you created that kind of an incentive, but do they have their brains open? I mean, or not? So that's something that, I mean, there's lesser, I mean, the impact found is very small and insignificant of such kind of a
Sure,
policy.
Okay,
In
thanks.
fact, I mean,
Puneet.
the effect may be negative on the good students who now have to
Yeah.
sit with the students who are not
Yes.
interested in coming to class, and now they'll disturb the
Yes.
class.
Yeah, yes. Thanks, Puneet. I think I mean, let's open the floor to other students. And they're already asking, and I think Jinal has raised her hand. Thank you. Thanks, Amol.
Yep. Welcome, Supratim. Jinal?
Yes, Jinal.
Yeah, so I also appreciate this presentation because it was kind of really very enlightening. Though I also missed some part of the presentation. So I'm not really very sure whether this question was also covered. This group is particularly a group of students who are very young in terms of their age, because it relates to primary education, if I'm not wrong, and if I have understood the presentation correctly. Now, when we talk about experiments and experimental studies, I think the testing effect also plays a crucial role. And when it is this particular group of students, I consider that it might play a crucial role in terms of their responses. So if, let's say, I'm an 8-year-old or a 7-year-old or a 6-year-old, I know that I am being tested, and that also might manipulate my answers.
Hmm.
So is there a way to control for this in this particular age group, or for that matter in general? And if we do that, then how do we do that?
So I'm not sure if I'm clear. So when you are saying when an 8-year or a 7-year-old knows that I'm being tested,
Yeah.
do you mean like an experimental test
Yes.
being done with them?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yeah, okay.
basically,
So they
yeah.
know that they are a part of an experimental group and a
Hmm.
study is being conducted on them.
Yeah,
To
yeah,
this effect, they are being tested,
right.
right? So if I am a part of the experimental group, I know that I am being tested.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I might end up manipulating my answers just because of the fact that I know that I'm being tested.
Exactly.
That
exactly.
is what is my precise question, that how do we control for this testing effect in these kind of studies?
Yeah. So
And
you are
particularly in this age group, because these are very small, young, a zero primary education students. So,
Mhm.
so that
So
is,
yes, you're absolutely correct. I mean, if you know that you're part of an experiment, then your behavior may not be, I mean, what you'll observe if you were sitting in a real world life situation. And to control for those things, I mean, if you are working with, let's say, an average, an age group of 7 or 8-year-old, then typically the permission is to be taken by parents. So the kids won't know much about experiments in general. And it's the permission that has to be taken by parents for the ethics sake. Or if that's an intervention, for instance, in the kind of intervention that maybe, let's say, you're talking about incentives, in kind or monetary incentives, then you could collaborate with school and take permission from school, make sure that there are no ethics issues there, schools are convinced, and then you do that intervention so students won't know about it. For instance, I mean, the kind of intervention that I've done in past, if those interventions do not have, I mean, much of ethical issues, then you can do them and in the end inform students that this was a part of an experiment, and I now want to use this data to do some data analysis and maybe do some research on it. So if you are willing to share your data, give us your permission. So instead of informing them in the beginning, you inform them at the end. So most of these field experiments that are done they're done more in a natural setting wherein people won't know much about the experiment. But there's another side of experimental economics, which is typically done in lab or lab in the field, wherein people do know about experiments. People do know that they're part of an experiment, and all the decisions that they're taking, they're part of an experiment. But that's where, I mean, the experimentalists, what they say is that we are designing the experiment, we are making the decisions tied to the incentive. So if you are giving me a decision, if you are taking an action, and that is not in your best interest, that is not what you would have done on any other day if you were not a part of experiment, then you're going to lose out, because I've tied the incentive in such a way that you have to be truthful in your revelation. So truthful revelation is the mechanism we call it, or incentive compatibility is what we call it. So we design the experiment in such a way that every decision that you're taking, it has an incentive tied to it. So if you do not respond to what you believe truly, then you're going to lose out. So that risk leads you to respond truthfully. So that's the part of lab experiment wherein subjects are informed prior, a priori, that they're going to be a part of an experiment. In field experiments, I mean, such kind of situations are taken care of, because otherwise, as you said, I mean, the decisions are going to be affected. If I inform somebody that you're part of an experiment, now write this test, it's going to be affected. So those kind of things are taken care of in the field settings, in the real settings.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So, yeah, Puneet, I think your presentation has led to some excitement in the chat box. There have been some suggestions about what we can use as, for improving learning and so on and so forth. So, Veena or Pranav, do you have something to say on this, or Veena or Pranav, anybody, any of you?
Yes, sir. May I add?
Yeah, sure.
So, sir, the question that one of the faculty asked, that how do we know that if a student is intrinsically motivated or not?
Right.
So to that, I think that one way to know is that how many questions they ask. It will show the curiosity they have about learning the subject. So I think that it is the intrinsic value, the motivation that they have.
But if we don't have a participation score in the course outline, because
Yes,
you'll ask
sir.
questions because you get 20% grades for participation.
Yes, sir. Perfect.
Right?
Yes, sir. So true. And what Veena was pointing was that if we like track the number of hours spent studying without when there is no exam, so that will also show the intrinsic motivation that even if there was no one judging you on how much you study, like there was no external motivation like marks, so it will also track out like your motivation to learn something intrinsically.
Yes, yes. So that's correct. But the problem that as researchers, I mean, we want a measure of that. So this is a good measure, but where do you get it? Where do you find out the number of hours that a student is spending at studies after the exam, after school hours, which is extra? You don't have a data set on that. If the data set that you can have is, you can ask students to self-report, but I mean, self-reporting has its own problems. So
Yes, sir.
I mean, theoretically, yes, it's a very good measure. What you said, I mean, the number of questions that a student is asking, or what Veena said here, these are good theoretical measures, but you need to have, I mean, a way to measure them, a way to quantify them, so that you can take them into analysis. Supratim, would you like to add something to that?
No, I mean, I'm just saying that, the whole point is studying more for like more number of hours does not necessarily mean you're intrinsically motivated. It may also mean you have a very low opportunity cost because you have nothing else to do, right? I mean, so I mean, I can like give you a lot of examples of my family members who have not studied more than 3 hours a day, and they all have scored toppers in their own class. I mean, it's just that, the whole point is, when you study, are you actually studying? You're not spending time on WhatsApp. That is, how you actually can measure. But then that's impossible to judge, right? So so this hours thing, I personally would be very much against it, because it may just actually, you have nothing else to do. You are just like staring in front of the book, and you are just showing everybody, dekho hum kitna matlab pad rahe hain. But I mean, really, you might just be wasting your time, right? So we don't know. But yeah, I mean, I really like what Professor Amol said, that that Puneet's presentation has got so many nice questions from the students. I think that's a sign, that's an encouraging sign. I mean, we, the old faculty, we should, like, I mean, shut up and let the students talk, I think.
Yeah, Veena, Veena is raising her hand.
Yes, I had a question. In one of the slides, Puneet sir, you said that maybe child learning can be taken as as a y variable than the three other x variables that can be taken. I wanted to ask if beyond the endowments of the parents, can the endowments of the proximate community also be taken as a X variable? And
Yes.
it doesn't have to be the physical community, it may be even relatives, basically the group of people which students interact with on a regular basis and are influenced by, but they are not the parents or siblings or grandparents.
Yeah, definitely. And in fact, I mean, not in this exact manner as you're saying. I mean, the neighborhood or people living in the neighborhood, but many studies take into account the neighborhood attributes, because they are very highly correlated with the kind of people you're going to interact. So if you are living in, let's say, an elite neighborhood, then that tells a story that you're going to be interacting with highly educated people, people who are, I mean, kids of sort of industrialists, businessmen, or highly educated professionals. So you can take those neighborhood attributes, and that, in some sense, controls for those factors which are about whom are you interacting with. But of course, I mean, what you're saying is definitely something that matters. If you have data on that, you should include it. But typically, data on that is not available. So neighborhood attributes take care of that.
Okay. So Prathna Iyer, you have a question?
Yeah,
Okay.
so I have a question about, like, a very general question about research, experimental research. So if you have like your theory part and then the
Prathna, are you from
empirics.
Ahmedabad University? Just
Yes, sir.
okay, yeah,
Yeah.
go on.
So if you have your theory and empirics, is there, so you said that researchers tend to use both or either one of the two, and either they go from theory and then they take, empirics, or vice versa. Is there one that's recommended over the other, which one you take first, whether you come up with a theory? Because, I mean, I'm not a researcher, so I wouldn't know, but if you have a theory and then you move on to getting your numbers, wouldn't that influence, like, wouldn't that put a little bit of bias in the way you're selective about it if you have a theory in place?
Uh, so I mean, the most recommended route is to have a theory and then go for empirics, and this is typically what experimentalists do. But when you're talking about the secondary data, I mean, you test that data, you figure out certain results, and people may want to then think of a theory that explains those results. So in that case, you can choose to go for theory later. But again, I mean, in majority of the research papers, you'll find theory coming first and then empirics coming. And so your question is, if we think about theory first, then will that not bring a bias? So, I mean, it may, but in an ideal world, when you talk about theory, you're talking about a story of X causing Y, right? So you have a story in mind, and then through data, you are testing it. Even if there's a bias in the hypothesis, your data is going to justify or nullify that, right? So in either ways, and if data does not support the theory, then, I mean, the theory does not work, so you have to modify it. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I mean, many of us are researchers here. It is a field wherein there may be a lot of manipulation going on. I mean, you may start with a theory and then you test with data, and the data does not support it. You go back to the theory and you sort of change it to support the data, right? So there are all these biases existing in the world of research. But yeah, I mean, that's all out there.
Right.
But
Okay.
ideal way is theory, then theory, fix it, and then go to the experiment. And in fact, just to tell you, to prevent such biases, to prevent such manipulative practices in experiments, especially, AEA registry is something which has started, wherein you have to register your experiment, you have to register your design, you have to register the findings, the hypothesis that you're going to test before you run the experiment, before you collect your data, before you do the data analysis, so that after you've done the data analysis and you found certain results, you don't have an incentive to go back and change it, because you've already published it. So on that online platform, you go and publish that design, that theory, that hypothesis. So as a result, you can now, even if you may have an incentive to, you can't change it, right? So that's a commitment strategy that as a researcher you're making to the ethics.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so we are already running out of time. Does anybody have any other question, or we can? Okay, so thank you, Puneet. It was really wonderful to, and obviously these are some privileges we enjoy at Ahmedabad University, being your colleague and getting some of these sharp observations about using experimental methods, which is becoming obviously a very, very important area of research. So kind of this whole question of causality and correlation and the way you showed those examples was pretty good. So one can learn econometrics by watching cartoons too. So maybe Puneet can start a cartoon strip, picking up some of these cartoons to help illustrate some of these economics problems. And very, very interestingly, Puneet's lecture today reminded me of Woolridge's book, where he uses a very similar approach to teaching econometrics. So Puneet can obviously use cartoons to illustrate it a lot better, and I'm
There is
sure.
a book, Amol, there is a book called Mostly Harmless Econometrics.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Yeah, so I think we can Puneet can write a new book like Mostly Harmless Econometrics by Puneet.
Sure. So thanks, Puneet. We look forward to your book, and maybe we can have a conversation about your book next time. So thank you so much for joining us. And next week we'll continue with this, and we have a fairly interesting and a very different topic next week, which is how economists analyze violence in society, by Professor Pallavi Vyas. We will be sending you a poster and so on and so forth. So feel free to pass it on to people interested in the topic, interested in looking at BA and MA economics from different lenses, and one is hoping that through these webinars you understand that we are taking a different approach to doing economics at the university. Thank you.